Back in 1923, a really chaotic, totally failed attempt to overthrow the German government should have been the end for a tiny, fringe political party. But instead, it actually became its launching pad. So today, we're going to dive into the Munich Putsch, that's a German word for a violent coup, and the incredible story of how a spectacular failure set Adolf Hitler on his path to power. And right away, we're hit with this massive contradiction that historians still argue about. I mean, was the Munich Putsch a total disaster that nearly wiped out the early Nazi Party, or was it somehow the single most important stepping stone to their eventual success? That's the big question we're going to unpack together.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at that central contradiction. Then, we have to understand the crisis that was absolutely tearing Germany apart at the time. After that, we'll walk through the actual events of the coup, step by step, look at the completely unexpected aftermath, and then finally, we'll reach our verdict.
All right, let's jump right in with the central puzzle of the putsch itself and get to the heart of why this story is just so darn complex. On the surface, the story seems pretty straightforward. This politician you've probably never heard of, Adolf Hitler, tries to violently overthrow the government. His plan is a mess, it's disorganized, and it fails, badly. He gets arrested, thrown in jail. By all accounts, that should have been it. Career over. A total, clear-cut failure.
But here's where the story twists, because buried in the rubble of that failure were the seeds of his future success. See, the putsch didn't just happen in a vacuum. To really get how this disaster turned into a golden opportunity, we first have to understand the crisis that had Germany in a chokehold in 1923.
And this brings us to the backdrop of the whole affair: Germany in crisis. The new Weimar Republic, which was Germany's very first democracy, was young, it was fragile, and honestly, it was deeply unpopular with a lot of its own people. It was basically a powder keg waiting for a spark.
So, there was this really toxic idea spreading like wildfire, especially among nationalists and old army generals, the stabbed-in-the-back myth. It was this totally baseless claim that the German army didn't actually lose World War I on the battlefield. No, they were supposedly betrayed by the politicians back home, the very same people who signed the humiliating Treaty of Versailles and were now running this new democracy. This created a huge amount of anger and resentment.
Now, on top of that political poison, you add an economic catastrophe. See, Germany couldn't pay its massive war debts, so France and Belgium just marched in and occupied its industrial heartland, the Ruhr. The German government's response? They told the workers to go on strike, but kept paying them by just printing more and more money. And that lit the fuse on hyperinflation.
And the human cost of this, it was just devastating. I mean, imagine your family's life savings built up over generations becoming worthless literally overnight. A loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. The middle class, the usual bedrock of a stable country, was completely wiped out financially. The government looked weak and clueless. And when people get that desperate, they start listening to extremists who promise easy answers.
So the country is on its knees, and Hitler looks at all this chaos and thinks, this is it. This is my moment. He'd seen Mussolini's March on Rome in Italy and figured, hey, I can do that too. Which brings us to the actual events of the putsch.
It all went down over 2 incredibly chaotic days. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler and his crew of stormtroopers burst into a massive Munich beer hall right in the middle of a speech by Bavaria's leaders. After a super tense night of threats and shaky promises, Hitler gambled everything on a big march through the city the next day. He was hoping the army and police would see his parade and just join him. They didn't.
Okay, so picture this scene. The Bavarian state commissioner is talking to about 3,000 people, and suddenly, Hitler storms in, whips out a pistol, fires it into the ceiling, and yells that a national revolution had begun. Then he shoves the 3 most powerful men in Bavaria into a side room at gunpoint and demands they support him. They nervously agree, but I mean, what else are you going to do with a gun in your face?
So, the next day, those 2,000 Nazis march through Munich. But their bluff gets called. They run straight into a line of state police. A short, brutal gunfight breaks out. And when the smoke clears, 16 Nazis and 4 police officers are dead. Hitler himself actually dislocated his shoulder in the panic and took off. The coup was over. A total failure.
So that should have been it, right? Game over. But what happens next is the most crucial part of this entire story. This is where we get to the really unexpected consequences.
So Hitler gets put on trial for high treason. But instead of this being his downfall, it turned into the biggest propaganda victory he could have ever dreamed of. He completely flipped the script and turned the courtroom into a national stage, giving these long, passionate speeches, bashing the government, and pushing his vision for Germany. And thanks to the newspapers covering every second of it, people all over the country were hearing his name for the very first time.
And then came the sentence. For high treason, a crime that could literally get you the death penalty, he was given just 5 years in prison. But wait, it gets crazier. How much of that did he actually serve? Just 9 months. This incredibly light sentence from sympathetic conservative judges just went to show how little power the Republic really had.
He didn't just sit around in his relatively comfy prison cell either. He used the time to dictate a book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. This book would basically become the Bible of the Nazi movement. It laid out everything, his entire hateful worldview, his disgust for democracy, and his aggressive plans for Germany.
And this, right here, is the most critical takeaway from this whole affair. Prison gave Hitler time to think, and he realized something huge. Trying to overthrow the state with violence just wasn't going to work. He needed a new strategy. He would use the system to destroy the system. He decided to reorganize the party, become a master of propaganda, and win power legally, through elections. The failure of the putsch taught him the exact lesson that would eventually bring him to power.
Okay, so let's circle all the way back to where we started. What's the final verdict on the Munich Putsch? Was it a failure, or was it a success?
Well, the verdict is really a tale of two timelines. In the short term, it was an absolute undeniable failure. The coup was crushed, the party got banned, and Hitler was thrown in jail. But in the long term, the consequences were a massive success for his movement. He got nationwide publicity, the 16 dead Nazis were turned into heroic martyrs for the cause, and most importantly, it forced that critical shift in strategy towards winning power through the ballot box.
Ultimately, this is what it all boils down to, and it's what most historians agree on. The Munich Putsch was a tactical disaster that turned into a huge strategic victory. It was, quite literally, the failure that made Hitler.
So we'll leave you with one final thought to chew on. What if the judges of the Weimar Republic had given Hitler a sentence that actually matched the crime of high treason? What if the government had treated this putsch like a genuine threat to its existence, instead of just a minor rebellion by some loudmouths? It really is one of modern history's most chilling what-ifs.